Okay, Melissa. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the K-3 Literacy Ad Hoc Committee meeting. We're going to do call to order and roll call.
Chairwoman Clark.
Here.
Vice Chair Foley.
Here.
Member Burke. Member Canto.
Here.
Member Castro. Member Cruz.
Here.
Member Durando. Member Hamilton. Member Hart.
Here.
Member McMillie.
Here.
Member Reff.
Here.
Member Hickman.
Here.
Member Wellborn.
Here.
Member Yanez.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank God I'm not last anymore.
I'm used to it.
Me too. So I'm so glad.
All right, we'll do call to the public.
Chairwoman Clark, no calls to the public have been received.
Okay. Moving on to the next item on the agenda is a presentation and discussion on SB 1318, the dyslexia screener. And Sean Ross, you're up.
Hello, Member Clark, or Chairperson Clark, members of the committee. For those of you who don't know, I'm Sean Ross. I'm the Director of English Language Arts and Move On When Reading at the Arizona Department of Education. And I am here today to discuss Senate Bill 1318, which calls for dyslexia screening of students and dyslexia training for teachers. I'm going to go through the presentation, but as always, please stop me when you have questions. I'm happy to answer what I'm able to. So it's always important to begin any presentation on dyslexia with discussing that there is a statutory definition for dyslexia in Arizona, and that dyslexia is a specific learning disorder that's neurological in origin, and that typically results from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is unexpected related to other cognitive abilities and the quality of classroom instruction. So it's important to establish that we do have a definition for dyslexia in statute. Mm-hmm. And some of the characteristics of dyslexia that you see most commonly, though not every student or every child with dyslexia will have all of these characteristics, are family history. When they're younger, difficulty learning to speak. As they enter school, difficulty with learning the names of letters and numbers. Difficulty pairing sounds and letters. Difficulty with accurate and fluent word recognition. Poor spelling, and poor decoding abilities. There are some secondary consequences for dyslexia that aren't always discussed, but these are actually in statute, so I thought it was important to point them out. Because students with dyslexia often struggle to decode, they often struggle to read, they don't tend to read as much as their peers. And so eventually over time, that can result in a reading deficit, in a deficit in vocabulary and background knowledge. And that's going to lead to potentially to some problems with comprehension. We know from research, Dan Willingham, Kate Kane, that vocabulary and background knowledge are the two key drivers to reading comprehension, barring any issues on the decoding end. They're the two key drivers to comprehension. And so if a lack of reading experience is going to potentially lead to a deficit in those two areas, which will then compound the struggles with reading comprehension. So it's important to note that as well. I think it's important whenever we talk about dyslexia to talk about some of the dominant myths involved with dyslexia. We offer a training through the department called Teaching Reading Effectively. It's a 5-day training on the science of reading. And at a certain point in the training, we stop and say, we talk about dyslexia. We always open that section by asking, what is dyslexia? We want to sort of take the pulse of the room. And the people who attend this training are amazing. They're well-intentioned, they're seeking, to improve, so this isn't a comment on them at all, but quite often, the first thing we hear after that question is, flipping letters, reading words backwards. So we want to open with the idea that that is actually a dominant myth of dyslexia. Now, dyslexic students may transpose letters. That may be an issue for some students with dyslexia, but it is not the identifying characteristic. In particular, young students, when they're learning to write, often transpose letters. It's actually quite common. My daughter did it all the way up till second grade. It becomes an issue when it goes late in later grades. As students advance past that point, it can be an indicator, but by no means should it be the headline. It shouldn't be the first thing people think of when they think of dyslexia. One of the other myths is that it's a visual impairment, that it's related to the way a student sees words. And dyslexia is not a visual impairment. Dyslexic students see words the same way that students without dyslexia see words. It's a phonological deficit. It's in the ability to hear and parse out sounds, to manipulate the sounds of language. So that's a common misunderstanding as well, that it's rooted in visual impairment, which is not correct. There's another myth that dyslexia is connected to a student's IQ and to student's intelligence, and there is no correlation. There's no connection between IQ and dyslexia. So a student with dyslexia can be just as intelligent or more intelligent, whatever that student is, to his or her peers. And that actually runs both ways. The dominant myth for a number of years was that a student with dyslexia was less intelligent. Obviously not the case. There is an interesting sort of momentum now that the opposite is true, that a student with dyslexia is automatically more intelligent than their peers, and that's not the case either. There's no correlation between the two. Students with dyslexia do have different ways of approaching problems, different ways of problem solving that they develop that do give them very interesting brains, especially as they grow into adulthood, but it's not connected to IQ. And then the final myth I wanted to address is that all students with dyslexia, or all children with dyslexia, have dyslexia present in the same way. It looks the same in every kid. And it's just not the case. Dyslexia is a spectrum, it's a spectrum issue. So there are some students with dyslexia who have very mild dyslexia, and there are going to be some students with much more severe struggles in reading because of their characteristics consistent with dyslexia. Any questions so far? Okay, so I'm going to get to some statistics, and these are from Louisa Moat's Basic Facts About Dyslexia. The number, I don't want you to get hung up on the numbers. The numbers are debated, depending on what circle you're in. We are saying, and we are open to other interpretations, but this is what we're saying. We're going off of Louisa Moats, who's an expert in the field, that it's estimated that 5 to 10% of the population has dyslexia. Now, we know about 20% of the population has language processing struggles. So that number, you'll hear that number quite a bit, and that is accurate for the general umbrella of language processing disorders. But it's estimated about 5 to 10% for dyslexia. And another number we like to discuss is the population of students who are identified as having a specific learning disorder. That's actually the largest population of students in special education, and 85% of those students have a disability, a diagnosed disability with reading or language processing. All right, so let's get to the legislation.
Sean,
Oh, yeah.
can I ask a question, please? So on the prior slide, with 7% of the total population being diagnosed with a specific learning disability, and if I'm correct, I think our statewide number for students identified with some kind of IEP, with some kind of learning issue, that's more around 12%, 11 or 12%, is that right? So is there some kind of explanation for what that gap is? What other things are in that category of special education?
Member Cruz.
I can address it. There are many other categories with regards to special education. Specific learning disability is only one. Certainly autism, emotional disability, speech and language impairment.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, so the legislation itself calls for sort of two large components. The first I'm going to discuss is teacher training. Now, the legislation calls for ADE to hire a dyslexia specialist to create that position. Also, that person will work with the Move On When Reading team, Sarah and I, and also our special education team, two of whom are here. We have Sandra Figueroa and Kim Rice, who are amazing. And we're all going to work together to help develop this training, the trainings that are being called for. Now, the legislation does call for the trainings to come in a couple of formats, virtual and face-to-face. The training needs to be based on, or in part based on, knowledge and practice standards from a national or international association on dyslexia. The International Dyslexia Association has its knowledge and practice standards readily available. It's a document we're very familiar with and will use in building this training. And the training will center on not only empowering teachers to better identify students with characteristics consistent with dyslexia, but also best practices for helping those students. We're particularly excited about this legislation, one, because it's going to help more kids, but two, the strategies used to help students with dyslexia are the strategies used to help students learn to read and read effectively, just altered in intensity and frequency. So we're very excited about this. This is the message we've been sending all along, and we're glad that it's ringing a bit louder. And so the legislation, the key piece is that it calls for at least one K-3 teacher in every school in the state that instructs K-3 third grade students to have received dyslexia training by July of 2021. So this is a big job. It's training a teacher at every school across the state. And actually our messaging is not the at least one part. You're not going to hear that a lot more from us at all because with, just life and transition and teacher turnover, we're going to say, well, all of your teachers should receive this training, which is why we're going to really focus when we are in that process. We're going to really focus on building a viable webinar and electronic-based version so we can hit every part of the state. It doesn't make sense to train 20 people in a room when we could train 500, at once in a webinar series. So we're taking all of that into account.
Sean, just on the timeline there, so the screeners are to be in place at the beginning of next school year.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a sec.
But the training not until after that school year.
Yeah, the cart's a little bit before the horse. It would seem to make more sense to have the training first and then the screening second. That's the way the legislation was written, and so it's the way we're addressing it. But you're right. In looking at it, it seems as if the training might have needed to come before.
Well, so will training be available by the beginning of next school year and just not required until the end, or will it not be available?
Well, we're not in developing and building and implementing the training. We're not married to these deadlines other than we have until this date. We're not seeing that 2021 date as the start date. We're seeing it as an end date. Now, having said that, you are all very fully aware of the staffing and financial realities of the Move On When Reading team, the fact that we're 1.5 people, the fact that we have 500 literacy plans coming in, 4 of which have already come in and been approved over the course of the next couple months, and on top of everything else that we do. So we will be involved in developing and implementing this training. There are some other dominoes that need to fall first. I don't remember, Cruz. I don't know if you want to discuss that.
So what Sean is so eloquently trying to dance around is that we are working through some budgetary constraints in our department, as this was an unfunded mandate for us.
Yes, so there were $0 attached to this legislation, and so we are doing our best to, and actually, to be honest with you, we saw this coming. We saw the legislation coming. It's happened nationally. We knew it's a great piece of legislation. We were hoping it would hit Arizona. So we actually convened our own little ad hoc interagency team, which features Sarah Bondi, our K-3 literacy specialist, and our 2 members of our ESS team, as well as others. So we've laid some foundational groundwork. At the moment, we can't proceed until another legislative domino falls.
Right, and so we're working through that, and we have full intentions of hiring a dyslexia specialist. We have a few other things to get through, and we do want to let our team get mostly through literacy plan season because they are going to be the ones doing the hiring, and they need to be fully focused on literacy plans as is right now. So when he says this is not an end date, we don't want to be like just in time, oh, we're ready for the training and we just hit our deadline. We want to be ahead of that. Yeah. We want to be ahead of the curve and try to train teachers ahead of time. However, we need to also focus on what is at hand with literacy plans and also get through with what we need to have happen with our budget inside the department.
And I appreciate all that, but I just want to give the perspective from the field so that what I'm hearing is that by the beginning of next year, so through this year, school districts will work to identify a dyslexia screener, implement the dyslexia screener.
Actually, if you remember,
Wait,
I'm sorry to
without
interrupt.
training.
My next section will address, I think, a lot of your questions, and if not, we'll circle back.
Great.
So this is the first big piece of the training, of the legislation, is that teacher training component. So up next.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, question?
Yeah, thank you. So does that training have to come from the designated ADE provider or curriculum? Because it cites, the legislation here cites another statute, and I didn't look it up. So it says it has to comply with whatever is in 15219. So if a teacher has had that training through another provider, through a teacher preparation program, and can show proof of that, is that sufficient, or does it have to come through this process that we're talking about?
We can certainly look into that. That's a good question. Certainly, we would want to maintain the integrity of that training, so we can certainly look into that.
And because these are sort of early days, and again, we're still waiting on a couple pieces, it is something we're providing guidance on. We offer, again, that Teaching Reading Effectively training, which is a comprehensive 5-day training on the science of reading. So we are going to look into maybe the viability of that training satisfying the requirements. We've trained about 1,000 teachers a year. And then also having other additional options, because it's not possible for every teacher in the state to take a 5-day training. So we're looking at a menu of offerings so that we can meet the needs of the entire state. So up next we have, and Member Ref, if these don't answer your questions, please let me know. We have the screening component. And so what it calls for is all kindergarten and first grade students to be screened for characteristics consistent with dyslexia within the first 45 days of school. You'll notice I'm very carefully using the term characteristics consistent with dyslexia. The intent of the legislation is not to put schools or teachers in the position of diagnosing dyslexia, which would be rather inappropriate, especially if they don't have proper training. And so the screening is designed to identify kids with characteristics so that schools and parents can take the appropriate next steps. The great part about this is the screening, it calls for this in the legislation, and it's something we've been really pushing for behind the scenes. The screening it should and will be embedded in the already required screening structure in the Move On When Reading legislation. So as part of Move On When Reading, every student in kindergarten through third grade is screened for struggles with reading within the first, we actually advise the first 2 weeks of school. And so every K-3 kiddo is screened. We collect that data at the department. And so one of the things we liked about this legislation, one of the things we've been focusing on in addressing this component, is we don't want this to be another thing for schools. We don't want this to be burdensome either with time or with finances. And so we've done a lot of work, and I'll discuss the financial piece in a second, on the back end to try to reduce the burden on schools. And so thus far, we have yet to encounter a situation, and again, I'll get to this in the next slide, where it wouldn't be another part of that screening process. Now, there will be other screeners that are done at that same time. So there will be a couple of additional assessments, for example, but done in the same time period, very similar fashion. So not really an extra burden on schools. And then as part of the screening legislation, thankfully, there is a requirement for parent notification. So that parents are notified if their student is identified as having characteristics consistent with dyslexia so that they can take appropriate next steps. This falls right into the Move On When Reading legislation, where we have requirements for parent notification when a student is, first piece of notification is for all K-3 parents, just to let them know what Move On When Reading is. And then the minute a student is flagged as struggling, a second letter is generated and sent to parents to let them know where the specific area of struggle is occurring, what the school is doing to help, and then what parents can do at home to also be part of that literacy team. So this actually embeds really nicely into what already exists. And we are going to, as we did for Move On When Reading, we will develop template letters for the field that will be on our website that they can download and modify. So that kind of saves a little extra step.
Yep.
So the legislation calls for the addition of these 5 indicators for dyslexia. Phonological and phonemic awareness. So that is that ability to manipulate the sounds of words, the sounds of letters. It's the root of language development, the root of the development of reading skills. And so it is wonderful that it is being addressed in a meaningful way. It's also, as we go around the state, as we work with schools and teachers, it's probably the biggest gap in K-3 curricula around the state. So this is a really nice fulcrum to help schools and teachers examine their curricular maps and look to see if phonological and phonemic awareness are receiving the attention needed, particularly at K-1, though advanced phonological awareness skills really progress to 4th grade. There's rapid naming skills, so the naming of letters and numbers, but actually also objects. Students with characteristics consistent with dyslexia may sometimes struggle to recall the name of everyday objects like a table or a car. So that rapid naming skills assessment is there as well. The next two are really part of the same continuum. They're parsed out in the legislation, but they're basically part of the same skill set, which is marrying sounds and letters. It's the alphabetic principle. It's the sound-letter correspondence. And so the way we're interpreting it, and we're still fleshing this part out a little bit, is the reason it might have been separated is because if you have correspondence between sound and letters, that's down to the phoneme, grapheme level. So, P is going to make is P. Sound symbol recognition might be something larger, like vowel teams, trigraphs and digraphs, other pieces that build words as a whole. So that's kind of how it's the same continuum, but that's how we're interpreting it. The final one is a point of discussion at the moment. So it's nonsense word repetition. Now, you may be familiar with nonsense word fluency, where a student will be shown a series of usually one-syllable words that don't occur in the English language. So it would be something like, forgive me if this is a word, but they'll say something like SILL, and they'll say sill, because they have internalized the structures of the English language, and they know that FILL is Phil, and BILL is Bill. Well, nonsense repetition is an augmented version of this assessment. And a typical administration of this would be something like, instead of presenting a student with several single-syllable nonsense words and having them read them aloud to show that they have, again, internalized some of the basic structures of the English language, a nonsense word repetition assessment would involve a speech-language pathologist or a school psychologist reading a student a series of, let's say, 5 single-syllable nonsense words. And then that student repeats them from memory. And then 5 two-syllable nonsense words, and the student repeats them from memory. And then progressing to multi-syllable, sometimes even a paragraph. That's a version of what that assessment can look like. It is.
Interrupt there, sorry. So with that version, if that's what we're saying, that would mean that a speech-language pathologist or psychologist would have to implement that assessment for every student?
Remember, Ref, as always, you are one step ahead of us, so it's
right.
literally
I'll
coming
try
on
to
the
be
next slide.
patient.
So we were surprised, this full disclosure, we were surprised when we saw nonsense word repetition on an early draft of the bill, and the department provided guidance that this should either be removed or changed to nonsense word fluency, which we felt as an interagency team was more appropriate for a screening battery, for a universal screener. Now, we're not in any way contesting the validity of nonsense word repetition. It just historically has been a second step. When a student has been flagged as having characteristics consistent with dyslexia, then an assessment of this type might be given. It is an excellent assessment of working memory, of phonological processing. It's just we were concerned about its presence in a screening battery. Right. And I'll go into that detail a little bit more right now. So there's really good news. When we saw the legislation coming, Sarah and I started calling vendors. We ran a report. We looked at the most commonly used vendors for universal screeners in the state. We called all of them, and we said, hey, this bill is coming. This should not be a surprise because it exists in Oregon and Washington and Colorado and a number of other states. Are you going to be able to meet the requirements of the bill? Do you have a dyslexia screening tool built or that will be ready by the time the legislation calls for it to be used? And we very purposely, I'm not going to use names, we very purposely called a specific vendor first. And they said, yep, we've got it developed. And we knew they had it developed. That's why we called them first. And they said, yep, we've got all those pieces in it. That's again another reason we called them. And we called them purposely first because we knew they would do it at no extra cost. And so we said to them formally, are you committing now that these screening elements will be added to your already existing screener for no extra cost to schools? We are committing to it. Well, what that freed me up to do is then call vendor number 2 and say, hey, do you have this dyslexia screening thing built? Yes, we do. Will it meet all of the indicators? Yes, it will. Well, hey, vendor 1 is doing it at no charge. What do you guys have to say? Oh, yeah, we're doing it at no charge too. And then down the line. And so that has been really an effective technique. As recently as 2 days ago, I was on the phone with a vendor, And I said, are you going to do this at no charge? And they said, well, we don't have an answer to that yet. And I said, well, the other 5 vendors I've spoken to do, and this is Arizona, and it's going to matter. And they said, okay, we will get you an answer by the end of the week. So that part has been nice. So, Member Ref, as I said, we are doing our best to make sure this is not an added burden, either financially or time-wise, as much as we can. Now, the big hang-up for the vendors has also been nonsense word repetition.
Correct.
Every single vendor we have spoken to has said, without prompting, this is an inappropriate tool to include in a screening battery. Mm-hmm. It is a tool that historically is administered by a school psychologist or a speech language pathologist, so is not necessarily appropriate for a gen ed teacher to deliver. It is delivered one-on-one, and so that is a very big burden for teachers to deliver in a classroom of multiple students, and that it is, again, a secondary assessment. It's assessment that would occur naturally after a screener. The other concern they had was at the absence of nonsense word fluency. They said, well, we would have expected nonsense word fluency, not nonsense word repetition. Every vendor we've spoken to has said they are not adding this to their screener, that they don't believe it's appropriate, and they are not going to add it. And in fact, they have all volunteered, and I have the first one already, to write letters of support for that view. So we have letters coming in from vendors that sort of echo what we felt as well. We are open to discussion on that, but we have spoken to national experts that we know. We've spoken to the research scientists from these vendors who are national experts as well. And as an interagency team of experts, we have spoken. We've sort of yet to encounter anybody who thinks, oh, that really should remain. Mm-hmm. So that is one of the hangups at the moment. We are working sort of maybe behind the scenes to discuss that potentially being changed prior to the 2020 deadline, so that the concern is assuaged.
Good.
This might be a good place to stop for questions.
No, but the field says, go, Sean, go.
Thank you.
Member Ref?
Sean and team?
Yes.
Team.
Oh, me again, sorry. Okay, so I don't know, my timing on this may not be appropriate, but maybe one thing. So this year, we're all implementing our screeners. As you mentioned, 75 or 80% of us use the same one that are now currently splitting into 2 for next year. And what I hear, I think you saying, is that both of those are saying that they've got something.
That was call 1 and call 2.
That lowers my anxiety a lot.
Good.
But then, because that will be ready to go for 2021. But then, in 21-22, are we not pushing for a statewide screener, so that if we move one way or another, are we safe, or are we going to have to change again the following year?
So I would ask everybody to just, what I usually say is proceed and breathe. Because when you're trying to kind of redesign a system, and I think we're going to talk about our legislation later, you can't get too far out, right? So you need to take this a little step at a time. So work through this year. You're not going to get too far out in front of what you're doing. As we said, there are a number of issues here, right? We have some issues with this. You've got some changes here. We've got to work on the training. And then you have this pending piece that we're trying to work on, right? There's a number of moving pieces. So there's no absolutes. So you have no full answer to say, well, what are we going to do? What's this look like? We don't know what it looks like. We won't know what it looks like until we go through a full legislative session, and anybody else can weigh in on this. So my answer to you would be proceed and breathe. Prepare your teachers for this. I think your screeners are in fine shape. You're going to be in fine shape. We're going to proceed with developing training, which is all excellent stuff for teachers of reading. That will be excellent stuff for our kids. Will serve our kids well. And we're going to proceed with the work that we have here with this committee.
And I appreciate that. I honestly do. But also know, like, whoever is leading, whoever has the voice that's leading, or the liaison, Bibble's next. And I'm sure I'm like 75 to 80%. So there'll be a large investment in time and energy, resources, training, buying new materials. And if I knew that the following year the state was going to require one particular screener, I would make that move next year instead of being in the same situation with the resources needed for training and ordering and getting up to speed. So whoever is leading in that capacity, it would be really great to keep the implementation in mind at the school level.
So in this sort of smaller realm of that, smaller piece of that, we are really doing the best we can to, our first goal is always to do this effectively, do it well, do what's best for kids. Second goal is, can we make this easier on schools? I released a video. Everything I'm saying today is released in a very brief video that Sarah and I put together over a month ago. I think it was literally released the day after the legislation was signed. So we've been prepping behind the scenes as much as we can. Again, there are always some dominoes that have to fall before we can move effectively, but we've been prepping as much as we can. And honestly, we're going to proceed the way the Mauer team always proceeds, which is full disclosure to the field. We sense, when you guys tell us especially, when we sense anxiety or fears from the field, we try to answer them quickly. We did this with like the Dibbles-Acadian split, the initial video on the dyslexia legislation. Even though it may not answer all questions, we are going to release guidance as we can, as we have more answers, so that honestly, actually, the field is as up to date as we are, and so that this is done effectively and done well. So this is just a reminder of the timeline. The law was just signed. By 2021, the screening, or for the 2021 school year, the screening will begin. And then by 2021, every school needs to have at least one, but oh my gosh, more than one, teacher who has received training in dyslexia.
No, we'll go back.
And so Sarah and I see every literacy plan in the state. So we have such a good sense of what's happening in the field that we're able to, I think, make some decisions in helping implement this legislation that are based on a knowledge base that maybe wouldn't have occurred if it were handled in another part of the agency, say. And so not that the other parts of the agency aren't fantastic, but just we have that base, we have that experience. And so I'm excited that we're bringing that to this. In the meantime, there are some great resources for schools and parents. ADE developed a dyslexia handbook. An interagency team, as well as stakeholders and experts from the field, developed a dyslexia handbook for practitioners. It's lengthy, it's about 150 pages, but it contains very specific language on how to identify characteristics consistent with dyslexia, and then some best practices to work with students who have those characteristics, which again are just best practices in the teaching of reading. And then Read On Arizona has developed a super shiny, sparkly, wonderful parent dyslexia family guide, resource guide for families. They put the Read On spin on it, which means it's beautiful and super accessible. And this is a really great resource for parents in particular. At every Teaching Reading Effectively training we hold around the state, every single time I present, and actually, that's okay. Every single time Sarah and I present around the state, we bring a stack of these. Member Clark is nice enough to provide them to us for free. It is also available to download for free from the Read On Arizona website. And again, very parent-friendly language to talk about what you might see in your student that might indicate that he or she has characteristics consistent with dyslexia, and kind of what to do next, how to speak to the school, how to approach the school about your concerns. So we have some resources in place. These are both available on the Move On Reading website. They're both available on the ADE Dyslexia website. That's about where we are. That's actually as up to date as my phone call 2 days ago. So are there any further questions?
Member Wilburn.
Sean, this is really helpful. Thank you. Quick question. What's the follow-on that gives us data on how schools are able to comply with that one teacher per school is trained in dyslexia? How are we going to be able to know?
So it's an excellent question, and I'm going to allude back to what Member Cruz said. It's a piece we have not yet developed. We're beginning, Member Wilburn, thank you for the question. We're beginning with what are the first fears, what are the first concerns, and we're addressing those to again, give everybody a pocket to breathe, and then we'll develop those answers as well. I don't want to give an answer today, especially that we don't have, because this is one of the rare times where we are being given time to build something right and build it well. And so we're going to build it incrementally as we best know. Now that data collection is very important, and it is a question that we have on our list of things to address, but we don't have an answer just yet.
So am I understanding that it's definitely something that you see as part of the program? It's just not number 1, 2, or 3, because you got a lot of other important priorities. But there will be some point in the future where we policymakers will know, out of 570 K-3 schools, or how many we have, I forget, 700, how many do we have? A lot. we've got a 70% compliance, 90% compliance. How well is the law being implemented?
So again, there's not a component written into the legislation for how data are to be collected, but it is something we will address because there's no point in having the law if we can't collect and reflect on the data and see how effectively it's being implemented. So I do think, and I think Member Cruz, it is something in the agency we see as a part of what we will develop. My knowledge of this process is that it will probably be receive an answer that a lot of things receive, which is add it to the portal. Yeah. And I love that. That's great. Sarah and I are more than happy to have that happen. I would just love to throw a little, if you add it to the portal, please add a little money, because we would love to have that to make changes to the portal.
Right. You also mentioned that, I wasn't aware of this, that the state collects the universal screening data that we currently do. And I understand that they're different vendors use, so it's hard to compare apples to oranges. But is there a report or any information that publishes that information on an annual basis of what the state of our entering kindergartners is? Mm-hmm.
So Member Wellborn, every year by December 15th, we publish the Move On When Reading Annual Report. We include all data collected in the literacy plan and in literacy data submissions.
No, I was asking about the universal screener.
It's in there.
So that's in there as well.
That's in there as well?
Yeah, so we have a section for aggregate benchmark data. The first collection of that data is from the screener. And then we have a beginning of the year collection, a middle of the year collection, and an end of year, so we can see progress.
Right. I've read that report, and I didn't remember that. Thank you.
Other questions?
Member Ruff. Not related to timeline, I promise. So it goes back to the first slide on the definition of dyslexia, and it talks about dyslexia, let's see, often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. So when we screen students in their first 45 days of kindergarten, they have not had previous instruction. Many of our students, especially students who have not had access to pre-K, they have not had that. So what is the validity and reliability that the vendors are talking about in terms of how they're identifying students who have characteristics of dyslexia when they have not had opportunity for instruction?
So, Member Ref, that's an excellent question. These are actually kind of two different things. What the definition is discussing is that there may be students who have deficits in their reading skills because they have not been provided appropriate or adequate teaching. They have not had good instruction. Mm-hmm. And so those students are not dyslexic. That could be remedied with some strong intervention, targeted intervention. Same thing with cognitive abilities, that if a student is struggling with reading, it may be due to another cognitive issue, may not be dyslexia. So I think in the definition they were very careful to say that the struggle the student is having in reading is not due to either of these two things, which helps you zero in more that it might be characteristics consistent with dyslexia. What I will say for the screening is that actually characteristics consistent with dyslexia, I need a button that just says that, can be detected very early in children, actually well before they enter preschool. Because it's a phonological deficit, you can notice it in a child's ability to rhyme, a child's ability to break a simple word into syllables, a child's ability to manipulate a phoneme. If you say cat, and then you say, but the k is now a b, and they don't know bat, which is a little advanced, but you can detect those characteristics. So there is the ability to detect characteristics independent in that early kindergarten phase. At that point, the quality of classroom instruction doesn't enter at all. Mm-hmm. And actually, I'm going to be blunt, I don't think the quality of classroom instruction enters this law at all, because it doesn't matter if they've had great instruction or poor instruction. If they've got the characteristics consistent with dyslexia, they're going to need the help. So I see them as two very different things.
And I won't go back and forth, but
go ahead.
But just to challenge that a little bit, so we know, because we use DIBELS and we've got those phonological awareness screeners, and we can see in our own district and certainly across the state that students who are coming to us with no prior pre-K experience, they are more likely to score intensive because they have not had that exposure. They've not been asked to rhyme words or to break words into syllables. And we're testing them in the first couple of weeks of school. And it doesn't mean that they have any issue, except that they haven't had the opportunity. And so what I'm worried about is that our schools who serve higher poverty families will end up flagging a majority of their students as triggering some sort of dyslexia characteristic, because those screeners that you put on the slide look exactly, except for one, really just like what we're doing now, and we already see that discrepancy.
Sean, I'm going to have Member Cruz.
And then
wrap
I'll
us
have
up
you
here.
follow me up, Sean. So that's why specific training for dyslexia is so very vital to really ferret out the differences, because it is very, very different than those who just have not had the benefit of either preschool instruction or instruction at all coming in to kinder with a deficit. So it's just a very, very different animal, and it will once you see the difference, it really reflects very differently. So you can speak. Sean can speak more eloquently to that than I can.
Yeah, but we're expecting that we would not see a correlation between the numbers of students who are triggering a flag for characteristics of dyslexia and poverty. Is that what I'm hearing?
That is what. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, Member Cruz, Member Ref, one thing I would add as well is, the students are being screened in K-1, so there is a chance to look at data over 2 years. So even a student who is screened for, and again, we're not diagnosing, is screened for characteristics consistent with dyslexia in kindergarten, they're going to receive the same support. I mean, they still have a phonological deficit. They still have not received the same rich literacy environment or rich vocabulary environment that, say, a peer might. They're going to need those same remediations, those same targeted interventions. And so your data might look different than at first grade. I think, perhaps you're expressing a fear about an increase in diagnosis, and I don't know how accurately I can speak to that yet because I don't have data. But our messaging is spot them, help them, and then everything. That's kind of where we are. That's where we're living. So I understand your concern. Our response is kind of always, well, they struggle, so let's get them the help they need. And whether they struggle from this screener or that screener, we know they struggle. Let's get them the help they need.
Thank you, Sean, and thanks to your team for the excellent work you've done. As soon as this bill passed, guys were on it, and I just, again, kudos to all the work that you guys are doing to help the entire field. So,
Thank you. And again, just as a reminder, this video is up and available, and we actually sent it out, I think July 2nd. We sent it out to all of our Move On to Reading contacts, which is about 3,500 teachers across the state. Some of you on the dais even received it. Yes. So it's readily available. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair Clark, before we move on to the next agenda item, there were 2 calls to the public that were received late. So would you like to rehear item 1?
sure.
Okay, so first up, we're going to have Megan, followed by Jamie.
Hello, my name is Megan Lauji. Thank you so much for hearing me today. I am a parent of a daughter who has gone through this system. She is considered severely dyslexic. She is entering the 2nd grade. She can read 20 words. She was screened by Dibbles, and they did tell me that they did not know the difference between someone who did not have experience and someone who was severely dyslexic, so she was not identified. And we went through, we found out how easy it was actually to identify these students. We went to very many different dyslexia centers. Literally, it was a 10-minute thing. They told me, your daughter is severely dyslexic. You need to fight the school. You need to tell them. Because there is no education for the teachers for dyslexia, they would not believe me. They would not recognize these experts and myself because it was not required of them. And unfortunately, that's sometimes how it is. Just knowing that my daughter, it took 2 years to get her through the IEE process and through the remediation. And just her knowing that she has that changed her whole view of herself. And I feel like right now I agree, it's hard to tell the difference between someone who is severely dyslexic and someone who just didn't have the opportunity to do that. But this is so important for not just the teachers to understand, but also these children and their anxiety. I just want to be open, here for you. Is there any questions that you might have as a parent to ask me of how this process went, or as my view, if anything would be helpful, I'd more be willing to share.
Chair Clark, per the public comment rules, they can't ask
sorry.
you questions.
That's totally fine. This is my first experience being here, and I just really appreciate your time and your experience. I just really very much encourage you guys to do everything that you can. I have 2 other daughters that are very, who are not in the public system yet, that have been red flagged already for dyslexia. And I'm very personally invested into this bill, and I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your comments.
Last up, we have Jamie.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us to attend today. My name is Jamie Wong. I'm a pharmacist by training. I have my master's in pharmacoeconomics, so I wanted to address the economic portion of this bill and discuss that a little bit with this group. I am a trained dyslexic tutor. Why on earth would a pharmacist go through a week-long training seminar on how to teach teachers how to teach dyslexic students how to read? I have 4 children. My older 2 are not dyslexic. I taught them how to read very easily when they were 4 and 5 years old. My third daughter, when she was 5, was struggling with sound to symbol correlation. She couldn't recognize the number 1 through 10 after 3 preschool-type programs. Not even the number 1. She couldn't recognize that sound to symbol. I didn't know, I thought it was just because I'm a terrible mom, so I intensely did 3 times a day tutoring sessions with her, 15 minutes in the morning. I literally set up my office at her school so that during quiet time I could review the numbers and sound assemble with her, and 15 minutes at night. It took me 6 months, and she was able to then recognize her numbers. When we talked about phonological awareness, in kindergarten she couldn't count to 100 because she couldn't hear the difference between 13 and 14. That sounds like a completely distinct number to everyone in this room. We struggled again because 30 and 40 was the same number, and it took us a while to figure that out. Her kindergarten teacher didn't know what dyslexia was. I eventually got a private diagnosis, and I told the teacher she's dyslexic, and she said, I don't know what that means. We then were in the SUSD school district, very prominent school, 10 out of 10 at greatschools.org. First grade teacher, I explained she's dyslexic. She said, I don't know what to do. At no point did the school recognize and say, we need to proactively give this child an IEP or a 504. I, as a parent, have no working knowledge to even know to ask for something like this. So as we go through this process, I hope the Department of Ed changes that culture, okay? I am not the professional. The teachers are the professionals. They should be able to identify these students and say, this child. But I will tell you sincerely, the 2nd grade teacher, again, the school gave me the best teacher for her. And she said, I don't know what dyslexia is. And during the parent-teacher conference, she sat down, and she's a veteran teacher. She's probably going to retire within 5 years. And she started crying, and she said, Jamie, do you know how many students that I have taken to administration and said, I need help, I don't know what to do, and they won't give these children 504s or IEPs? She's like, I fought so hard. So my question is, how do we change that culture? How do we change that culture so that we identify these kids? We say, yes, you have dyslexia. It's okay. And we put a plan in place. The perfect world for me would have been, in kindergarten or 1st grade, to someone come to me, not me go to the school, and come to me and say, your daughter has characteristics of dyslexia. It's okay. We know what to do, and we have a plan in place. Don't be scared. Have confidence. Because for me, as a parent, I lost all confidence in the system, and I still don't trust the school system. And so that's why I had to get trained. And that really does need to change. So lastly, if you'll give me a couple more minutes from an economic perspective. 5 years ago, the pharmaceutical industry brought new life-saving therapies to market to cure hepatitis C, okay? The payers went crazy, went nuts. It's going to bankrupt the system. It's a $1,000 pill. You have to take it for 3 months. It cured hepatitis C, which means these patients no longer have to get liver transplants and stay out of the hospital. It has now saved CMS something like $50 billion in 5 years. Yes, they had to pay for it up front. Yes, they went crazy. But that's the economics of what we're going to go through with dyslexia. because if we train our teachers, okay, and if here's a tip, if we force our universities to train our teachers, then your problem is completely solved, okay? That takes your cost way down. So number one, get the teachers trained before they get out onto the market. Number two, when you look, there's actual economic studies on early intervention with dyslexic students. Allison is entering third grade. She was in special ed for 1 year. There's a very good chance we are going to pull her out and she will go into gen ed this year. Now think about that. A child who was caught in fourth grade will likely be in special ed literally their entire career. So when we look at the economics of what's in front of us, it's going to save us a ton of money in the long run. We just got to invest right now. And I know it's going to hit your budget, but I tell you what, you got an army of volunteers and you can put us to work. We are happy to help. I will jump in and do trainings. I'm trained. So whatever you need, we will be here for you. So thank you guys so much for all your work. We appreciate it. I'm not here for Allison. Allison's fine. I'm here for all the other kids who really, really need this help. So thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes the call to the public.
Thank you. On to the next agenda item, which is a presentation and discussion on the K-3 Literacy Ad Hoc State Board of Education approved recommendations on early literacy.
Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, staff is bringing this forward to you as just a refresher. As you recall, these recommendations were created by this committee and then were presented to the board at the December 2018 State Board meeting. It was at that point that the State Board approved your recommendations, which gave you all the go-ahead to start working on our next agenda item, which was any statutory changes. The board is also going to be reviewing this document at its retreat this weekend. So I wanted to have this committee have a final look and refresh on the recommendations to determine if there was anything that needed to be updated, or any tidbits of information that I should be aware of prior to presenting to the board this weekend.
Thank you, Alicia. So I'll let people have a moment, and I'm looking to see who wants to jump in. And this is in separate conversation beyond the last meeting's review of statutory changes, which we're going to get to. So I think in your heads, think about the non-statutory parts of the recommendations that either you want to reinforce or think about. I know, for example, Alicia, I would probably, having prepped for this meeting, I wanted to just throw out there that there's an important piece of as the 5-year assessment plan goes forward and things that we want to make sure that this group is utilized to help inform what the input and components of that of any adjustment to the common third grade reading assessment. I think we've identified there that would be what we'd like to see, but what that looks like in my mind, that's some of the most important work that will happen in that. So I don't know if others feel the same way, have more to add to that, but I think we want to get it right, is what I'm.
And Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, going off that recommendation, which is a common statewide third grade summative reading assessment, if you recall, that recommendation comes from a lot of the confusion that the current or the past AZ Merit, now renamed AZM2, has within their third grade reading assessment. It's an ELA assessment, so you're actually pulling a reading score from the ELA assessment, English Language Arts Assessment. Because of that confusion and the lack of data that comes, information that comes after that student has taken the assessment, this committee recommended to the state board, knowing that we were going down a new route for a new statewide assessment, to potentially look at a common statewide just summative reading assessment. That technically, most likely, does not have to be put in statute. The state board could put it into the RFP for that new statewide assessment for school year 21-22. But this committee, just checking, we still want to go down that route, because when I talk to the board this weekend, I want to be able to say that confidently to them that you truly still recommend this.
Member Yannick?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I am not a psychometrician at all, but I think rather than necessarily creating a whole new assessment just to capture that reading component within the ELA assessment itself, it's really just a question of the number of items to pull out and get a valid score. I mean, and I don't know how short we are of the statistically correct number to pull it out and get a valid reading score. It might not be that many, frankly. It could be something relatively low. So you could actually, I think, increase the number of items to pull out a valid reading score, which could theoretically be seamless. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily take any more testing time. It could be rolled out, I think, relatively easy. So that's just one thought that I would put out there. The other is just the framing under issue 1, where we're talking about sort of the menu, and I know that was sort of where we were. And this is just maybe a little bit beyond the scope, but I think it gets confusing when it starts talking about what 2019, 2020 was supposed to look like from an assessment standpoint, and if that's going to get forwarded to the board, I mean, I think that should maybe be amended just to reflect the current state of assessments in K-3. I don't think that necessarily changes the recommendations downstream, but just not to add confusion to the field.
That's a good point.
And Chairwoman Clark, Member Yanez is correct. This has not been updated since December of 18. But as staff, we don't want to update it without you all telling us, hey, go ahead and update this. That is an area in which we have recognized that needs to be updated with the new legislation for menu and our new 5-year plan.
Can I throw out one question for this group to respond to, which is just, would it be helpful in these recommendations to note what is required to be a statute update and what could be just done outside of statute changes? I don't know.
So if you look at
we have that.
You have that on the...
But this doesn't have that.
Correct, that does not have that. And the board members are also receiving this information from the next agenda item as well. And Catcher is going to go through that at the meeting with the board members.
That's helpful to know. Thank you. Member Ruff.
Mine sort of piggybacks on that. One clarification and then actually 2 clarifications. One is on exemptions. I thought that those were all in statute. Are those able to be changed through the state board, or are those statutory?
Chairwoman Clark, Member Ref, those are in statute.
Okay.
So that's why this one is highlighted as green, meaning it's...
Got it. Okay. And then the next thing is, that's what I always thought, but then I thought I saw some language somewhere that made me second guess that. The other question is that for number 1, where we're talking about the K-3 assessment system, and we had talked about recommending a statewide single kindergarten screener, right?
That's the first bullet point, yes.
That's the first bullet point. Is that, did I see in the language somewhere that we're also recommending that screener could potentially be, let's just say it ends up being Dibbles, right? That can serve as a screener, a progress monitor, a diagnostic assessment, benchmark assessment, or are we saying we're looking at statewide adoptions of all of those separately?
So Chairwoman Clark, Member Ref, in the recommendations, this committee also recommended a statewide K-2 benchmark tool to measure progress towards 3rd grade reading. That's more in line of something at the end, right? The end of those grades that mirrors what they're going to be assessed on in 3rd grade so that teachers can understand and know, like, okay, we need to work on these areas. We debated for a long time within this committee about potentially mandating like a statewide benchmarking system, which plays very well into a comprehensive system, early literacy system within the state. However, I think I was one of the ones I always bring up to this committee and to the state board that Arizona is a very local control state. So, I don't think there's going to be much political will for a complete change of our benchmarking systems in the early grades. However, when you look at the first bullet point of that common statewide entry-level kinder baseline universal screener, that is more likely to go forward because, again, we're looking at as a state, we know where every single one of our kindergartners start. Therefore, we can put resources to whomever needs them more. We can look and see what's working by that end of third grade. What are those school districts doing? We can continue the case studies. But as of right now, we all have different benchmark system at the beginning, first 45-day screener. So that's why within the statute change, we see just that universal screener change.
Great. So just to say it one more time, make sure I'm perfectly clear, we're looking for a statewide kindergarten universal screener and a statewide summative third grade end of the year test. But the rest, everything in between, will continue to be locally controlled.
No,
That's
not what we talked about.
Oh, that-
That's not what we talked
So
about.
it might be some clarification in language. So do you have a recommendation of, that would help clarify that? Or am I reading that we're missing a word in the second bullet?
We talked about a common statewide K-2 benchmark tool.
Yeah.
It doesn't say common.
It doesn't say common, but it does say statewide.
But what do we mean by benchmark? So that's the dibbles like 3 times a year? Or is that like end of the year?
It would be like a dipstick at the end of like first, at the end of second, at the end of kinder, statewide, the same tool, everybody using the same tool. That wouldn't preclude you from using what you're using.
It would be an additional
Would be an
assessment,
additional.
Standardized K1, 2.
Something.
Chairwoman Clark, Dr. Cruz, and Member Ref, it goes back to like when we're using Stanford's, the Stanford 10s, right?
In
They were
second grade.
In second grade, right? You had the universal
Maybe.
statewide Stanford 10. I'm sorry, Dr. Cruz, did you say something?
Maybe. It would have to be developmentally appropriate, all of that.
Right. We're not naming
Right.
things. We're just using that as an example of how that was used.
Correct.
I just want to be really careful that we're not identifying, for the purposes of this work and this recommendation, it is not, dibbles has not been identified,
Right.
nothing, right? So that we just want to be very careful about that.
So I had been thinking about it the way that you described and not the way that you all are describing. So I just want to make sure that we're like all understanding what we're putting forth. And maybe I'm the only one.
I'm sorry, Member Ref, I explained it the same way that Dr. Cruz explained it, which
Oh.
is at the end of the year benchmarks, it's all the same that aligns with that third grade assessment.
Okay.
And I think you're just have additionally what you already do is throughout the year,
Yeah.
there is some tool
All
that
your
you're
progress
using to
monitoring.
monitor progress on an individual
Right.
student level. So they're not at odds. They're just a
They're
chance.
different.
They're different, or they could be different. They, depending on, right? You still get the local control of whatever you're using throughout the year locally is what you use. And the vision was that we could have also a end of the year common tool that before third grade measures how progress, so that we know they come in at kindergarten because we have a universal screener, and every year we have something at the end of the year that is measuring our progress, so we can have some sort of common report of progress. I think, if I'm not capturing it correctly, this is the time, and thank you for putting this on the agenda so we could clarify these little sort of points of confusion.
No, I think
would
that
not
my
be part of that.
recollection is exactly that's what we were agreeing to.
I did not understand that. I apologize, and I do have concerns about that and would like to just be on the record that I do not support additional testing. I feel like we do enough testing in our schools, and to put in another statewide test at the end of the year for kindergarten, first, and second grade students that is not locally controlled, in addition to already the comprehensive systems that we have in terms of screeners, progress monitoring, benchmarking, and diagnostic assessments, seems excessive, and I'm not quite sure what value they will bring to what we're trying to do in the classroom for our students. I do understand having a common statewide kindergarten screener because of what we just talked about in terms of understanding as a state when students arrive at our doorsteps on day one of kindergarten, where is the need for additional support, instead of giving every student that same $200+ of support when they may or may not need it. So I understand that. I think that's good for policyholders and for stakeholders to understand where the need is and how that's differentiated by geographic area, neighborhoods, districts, et cetera. But beyond that, I just am not in favor of more testing. I don't think, as a person who has been in every level of teaching, intervention, professional development, curriculum assessment, administration, I don't see how a standardized test at the end of kindergarten, first and second grade helps.
Duly noted.
Chairman Clark,
Yeah.
I want to raise issue 5.
Oh, I was like, I thought there were only 4.
Right. So, just want to remind us, we worked very fast and furiously to try and get this document out. We were very aware of the timeline, and we had a lot of healthy discussion at the time to lead this to this document. But there was a need at the time to try and let's get it down to the few basics we can agree on so we can do something. And in the year that this group has been convened, or I've been part of it, I've come to learn that we have several different plans at the state level that have to deal with literacy. So we have the Read On Arizona plan, we have an ESSA plan, we have you in the Read On plan, you referred to another Arizona literacy plan. We had a component of the governor's plan that Don Wallace presented to us. And my question is it within the realm of this body, this ad hoc committee, that we should recommend that there be one plan, that there will be one document that articulates what we're trying to accomplish in reading literacy, what our goals are, and how we're trying to achieve it, so that it can serve all the different groups that are and stakeholders are involved, and so that we can recommend that to the Board of Education. We're having a retreat this weekend, and we've put together a 5-year timeline on assessments on what we're going to do. So we now have a 5-year plan, what we're going to do with assessments. And I'm thinking the same kind of approach could work for literacy, that we need a document that articulates what the state is doing and is the official plan, so that we have one roadmap that we're following on, and that we look at on an annual basis to assess how we're doing and updating our goals and strategies.
Anyone else want to comment on that? I think that's a perfectly valid and helpful recommendation. I don't know, this group can certainly make that recommendation, and it might be helpful in thinking about that is the intention of some of those different plans. Like the ESSA plan existed because of a federal requirement.
Right.
Right? Not necessarily to pull the vision for the state around literacy, but to meet some very sort of compliant things. I think the Read On plan was created 7 years ago to be that and tried to. So we are working on updating that, and we are open to including any additional plans or priorities. And I don't know if if this committee feels that that's if that's something you want to take on, making that recommendation, that would have to come from the group. Any other thoughts? Alicia, thoughts from the staff?
Chair Clark, Member Wellborn, you and I talked a little bit about this before the meeting. I think, if this committee wants to entertain the idea, but or if the board wants to tell the committee to work on it, would be more of an appropriate avenue. But I would say this to the state board, and I'd say this to you all, just be very mindful of the amount of staff you have to do some of this work. So just be mindful of that. And if it's a road that this committee and the board wants to go down, we also need to answer the question of how can we leverage the state relationships with different nonprofits, different state agencies, so that we're all helping to build something like this. Because I know for myself and for our staff that would lighten our workload if we worked collaboratively with different organizations as well.
So I heard not that this committee would do that work or that staff would do that work, but that you were asking for a recommendation of identifying how that could be.
Well, my first question is it our responsibility and role as the ad hoc committee of the state board? So, one of the things I've learned in being involved in the state board is that we just have a lot of players involved in in education, and that's the nature of how public education has been set up here in Arizona. And to the extent that we can get everybody on the same page, it would be valuable. It's a embedded practice in well-run companies and organizations and schools, for that matter, to have strategic plans that guide the direction and future of the work of an organization. And it was news to me just a month ago that we actually had such a plan. So that, shame on my ignorance for not knowing that something like this existed. It could well be the Move On When Reading plan is the one that's adopted, but I just think it needs to govern the work of what we're doing in that when we get through this thing, what's the next? What's our next charge, and should we continue the work of the ad hoc committee? What are the directives that are given to us from the state board? I think it's been vague, and I would suggest that it shouldn't be vague, that we should be given specific work and issues to tackle, and it should come from the Board of Education.
Thank you.
And then I have another question.
So that was item 5, which is I'm just going to capture as kind of a twofold. One is identify or help to inform a collaborative state literacy plan, and second fold, identify the ongoing work of the ad hoc. I think there may be two different things. What's item 6?
Actually, it's going back
5A.
to item 3.
Okay.
And it has to do more with the next item on our agenda, which is the actual language in the legislation. So it's kind of a twofold. I would like us to look again at the wording that we use for this issue, as it relates to what's actually in the legislation. So we use this word administration, and I don't think it adequately portrays what we want to see happen in the Mauer department. So really, because of the existing funding is so low, you're at a bare compliance level, and you're not able to do any of the good work that would be really impactful to improve reading instruction across the state, and all the things that we've talked about and that could be valuable. So would it be good to be more specific around what support is? Because I think there's an opportunity to really specifically address how can Arizona improve reading instruction in the classroom? What are the pieces of that? Is it about, do we want to see changes in teacher certifications? What level of training do we want to see? What kind of ongoing professional development is required? Do we want to require a reading specialist at every school, in addition to a dyslexia specialist for the district? Wouldn't it be great if we made sure that we had that required? On and on and on. This group has talked about that a lot, but I don't know if we've really done an adequate job of communicating in our recommendations that these are the kinds of things that need to happen if we're ever going to get to item 2, which is raising cut scores. And so it's just a matter of how you articulate the case and how this translated into the next item on the agenda, which is the actual legislation, which is kind of, the way it looks right now, it'd be really easy to delete that 2 sentences because it doesn't say much at all.
And that, are there any other comments or feedback on that? Because I think that's a nice segue into actually the statutory language, and we can address some specifics around that. Are we okay to move on to that? All right, then we're going to build on those comments by moving on to the presentation and discussion on draft statutory changes based upon the recommendations.
So, Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, if you recall, we did do this at our last meeting. However, we were just at quorum, so many of you were on the phone or could not attend. So I wanted to have another opportunity just to go through this prior to going to the state board at the retreat. Again, the board's not approving anything at the retreat, but we're just having a discussion with them to say, hey, are we on the right page? I do know that Member Ref has sent some information with her changes for the statutory drafts in front of you, which myself and or Ketcher will speak to on why some of your changes, Member Ref, wouldn't be appropriate in the legislative changes. You know, Ketcher is the expert in that. So I tell him we can talk about that. But I know that Member Yanez had some additions at the last meeting as well. So I am interested to know what Member Wellborn, what 2 sentences were you referring to in your last comment of the draft changes? Or were you speaking on issue 3 at all?
Well, actually, the last thing on the last page of the draft, the blue writing, I think it's actually only 1 sentence.
The bottom.
The bottom part, it's
Vague.
It's a lot of it is TBD, and I think we're missing an opportunity to really spell out
That would be in the verb.
what kind of resources are
You'd have to
needed
negotiate and it'd be in the verb.
to move the needle.
So, Chair Clark, Member Wellborn, maybe we could have Ketcher explain like what that section is called. I forget. Session law. Thank you.
Yeah.
Madam
Member
Chair
Yanez.
and members, for the record, Ketcher Baden on staff with the State Board of Education. To Member Wellborn's point, I would agree that it's vague right now. I think it was intentionally vague initially. This is a section that's appropriating money to the department. I think it would be appropriate, certainly, if the committee wanted to maybe think about, if not putting in the legislation, then at least having something on hand for us to point to. I think there are some things in the recommendations itself in the report that points to what that is specifically, but usually, like when agencies submit budget requests, for example, there's a whole funding issue, and there's what will we get done with this work, and what are the outcomes that'll be tied to it.
Stop there for a second.
And yeah.
So with what Deputy Director Baden is talking about is if agencies, if maybe Dr. Cruz, you can go back and speak with the superintendent and chief of staff and see if there's any additional funds that you're asking for in your budget, and then maybe you can bring that back to us at the September meeting. Because if we can align the recommendations with what you're already asking for, or at least be aware of what you're asking for, I think that would be good.
We did not do a K-12 budget ask.
Madam Chair, members, I'll also point out that the funding appropriation here is just for 1 fiscal year, so that's one-time funding. Generally speaking, that has a better chance of getting through, but it also, for things like training or things like professional development or going beyond the compliance piece, those are generally ongoing costs, or at least once every few fiscal years. So that might be something that's more challenging for the department. I think we initially kept it kind of vague because we were hoping to work with the department to see, like, well, because this is a funding ask for them, what is it exactly that they need, because they work with that every day. I'll also I'll mention there was discussion earlier. Actually, to Member Yanez, he made a point last time about timelines. We have revised this so that the timelines sync up with the 5-year assessment plan. So when we have the new assessment rollout in the 21-22 school year, that's when the new comprehensive system would roll out at the same time. We felt like that would give lead time and line up with everything else. And I'll also mention earlier there was discussion about the benchmark tool and additional testing. And on staff, if the ad hoc committee recommends and the board recommends staff to push this legislation, that's what we do and that's what I do, and that's my role. It would also, I think it's also my role to inform the ad hoc committee and the board too when it does come to them that, like Alicia said, it will be challenging, to say the least, to have both the statewide common universal screener and the benchmark test to be a common, that will be politically challenging for the reasons that Member Riff outlined is probably what we're going to hear the most. So certainly not advising not to go with that. The folks on this committee are the experts. The folks on the board are the ones appointed. We don't vote, but and if that's the research-based and policy-based decision that the committee and the board feels is the best outcome, I'm more than happy to advocate for that at the legislature. But I do think it's also my job to let the committee know that will be an uphill climb.
So I think the message in this piece is comprehensive assessment isn't going to move the needle. It's going to give us a lot of good data we need, hopefully, and we're hopefully going to have the money to analyze that data. But we can assess our students to kingdom come, but if we can't provide more statewide resources to the schools that need it, we're not going to move the needle. So, and you're right to us to suggest it's a political battle, and it's tough, and we may not get it. But I certainly think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that message comes across, that we need to invest more in the workforce that is responsible for teaching, instructing our kids. That's the bottom line. And we in the state, if the state wants to have these very ambitious goals about improving our reading rates, then we need to invest in it in some way. So I just think it's a one-sided ask at this point. I understand it's going to be difficult. I just feel like it needs to be the true component of what it takes, because it doesn't, you've heard me say this before, it doesn't make sense to improve cut rates or cut scores until we can help ensure the caliber of our workforce and our teachers.
Can I just piggyback on that, and then Member McMillan's going to speak. I just want to clarify that the vision for this document and the reason any of the recommendations are in the document is to improve outcomes around early literacy for all kids. The raising of a cut score is not the end goal. It is one tool.
Sure, but it's in there.
It's in there, but
Yeah.
that's not the destination.
I
right?
totally agree with you.
I just want to get really clear on that, because I sometimes hear, if we want to raise, if we want to get to raising cut scores, but that's not where we want to get to.
I understand.
Yeah. We want more kids
Right.
to read
I agree with
at
you.
grade
Okay.
level and proficiency, and there are a number of things. And we recognize, Catcher, and you're right to point it out, we might not be able to do all of those things in the first year. But I think if we don't start to say, if we want more kids to read, we have to build a comprehensive early literacy system that has these pieces, and we don't have that in Arizona at this point in time. And it might take us 5 years to get there, just like it's taking us 5 years on the assessment plan.
Right.
It might take us 10 more years to get
Right.
there. But can't keep limping along and pretending and saying why it's unacceptable that more kids aren't reading,
Right.
which I hear a lot.
Right.
Now, it's unacceptable. Why are we expecting different outcomes when we have the system that we have.
Right.
So with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Chair Clark. So I couldn't agree more with all of that. My only concern is that coming from a school district, and others here represent school districts as well, is oftentimes we get those unfunded mandates where you're going to have a reading specialist in every school, which would be
Right.
amazing. However, we don't always have the money for that.
Right.
So my fear is that we'll come up with something amazing to suggest, and then they'll say, yes, do that, but there's no money to back it. And so I think the idea that we have these great recommendations is wonderful, but we need to face reality. And is there going to be money to back that up?
Right. I totally agree.
Yes, absolutely. Member Ref.
And I agree with that as well, which is why I think that the first step is absolutely to have a statewide kindergarten screener so we know where we need to invest. We have to have differentiated investment. We just have to. And so that's a win, I see it, for my kids that we serve, is to recognize where the need is and apply the resources where the need is, that we can make some differentiated systems for intervention and for getting kids to where they need to be and stay on track early. So that was one thing. The other is that as I look at the first page that has the green, this is where my confusion was. So it says, green is statutory, right? Where it says
Correct.
ELL exemption to 3 years, that's statutory. But the one above that, number 5, don't retain more than once, that is not statutory?
Madam Chair and Member Ref, so this is one that I think we'll have to sit down with ADE's team and discuss a little bit. So there's the exemptions are who can be exempted is very clearly statutory, but the board, as the policy-making body for creating the rules on this, does, and the department is administering it, the board does have some leeway in the policies, and so on staff, I think I could make the argument that how often a student is retained could be something that the board could fill in the blanks on that policy. However, I think I could also make an argument that it could be statutory. So that's something that we can discuss more. I think it might be, for direction for staff, I think we have the direction that the ad hoc committee, and if the board ultimately wants to fulfill this, wants to see that happen. I think we just need to talk internally about strategically what's the best way to go about it. Unless, of course, the ad hoc committee feels very strongly one way or the other, but I think we feel it's maybe a strategic decision more than anything. And frankly, if the board, I think generally we advise if the board has the authority to do something, that we should not be asking the legislator to make that change for us if it's already within our purview. And when the statute is right now silent on how often students are retained, it's an open question. And so then it's, well, who gets to answer it? And I again, like I said before, I think we could make the argument that the board, under its policymaking authority, has the ability to answer that question.
So the interpretation is right now the statute is silent, but if a student is in 3rd grade and they don't meet the cut score, we have to retain them.
For exemptions.
Right.
Right, this is about more than once, though. That's
Right.
the part he's saying. The legislation is silent on.
So right now, if we have a 3rd grade student who had been previously retained, we don't have to retain them?
You want to speak to that, Sean? I'm just trying to think through the examples of that.
Chairperson Clark, Member Ref, I just want to make sure I understand your question. So you're asking if a student has been retained once, a 3rd grade student has been retained once due to the Move On When Reading legislation,
Well,
can they be retained again? Is that what you're asking?
I guess that's what I'm not understanding, is that right now, are you saying that the statute is silent on it, meaning there's an implicit discretion there about whether to retain or not a student who has been previously retained?
So there's no verbiage. I need to get back to you. I'm not 100% clear on what you're asking, but let me check the legislation and get back to you.
Yeah, I think
You
that
know
would
what
be.
I'm trying to say?
I think I understand what she's asking. So what I'm getting is, for example, if a student was retained in kindergarten and then they don't pass third grade AZ merit, can they be retained again? Is the confusion?
I thought they
Okay.
must be, but now I'm hearing the
My
statute.
understanding is they might have been retained kindergarten or first, but when they get to third grade, this is a whole new thing. And they can be retained under move on when reading only once, though. So they repeat third grade, and then if they don't pass the AZ merit test again, they can move on to fourth grade. But it doesn't reflect back to what happened in kinder and first previous years.
And there is, okay.
I think capturing this, the conversation is that we would not retain a child more than twice at third grade if they didn't meet the exemption. Was the conversation here? Was that conversation that I remember us capturing here? Correct?
Yes. Now, I think you guys are talking about what's written here as a recommendation, which is not reality right now.
That's right.
And what the question was is, in reality, and I believe, and and Sean can get back to us on this, is there is nothing about caps or on retention
For move on when reading.
when reading. So at the moment, the statute does not reference that at all, and that has, since the implementation began of that, always been a concern, because in theory you could have a student multiply retained because of third grade assessment results.
Because previous retention was never an exemption for move on when reading.
Right.
And this was because they can't be, the conversation here was they couldn't be retained more than once at third grade because of their score on move on when reading, was my understanding when we had this conversation.
Right.
But you're asking
I
about,
just am very
in reality,
unclear on what is the rule
what's
and
the
who
law of
controls
the
it.
land right now.
Got it.
Yeah.
There is the law does not weigh in on or reference any limit on retention around third grade reading at the moment.
So districts have discretion.
No, that doesn't give you discretion. It means that if they don't meet any exemptions and they don't pass above the cut score, you have to retain them.
Even if
And Chairwoman Clark, Member Ref, I just want to caution the committee, because you're going down all these nuances right now, and this is a live meeting. People can go back and see it, and I do not want someone at a district level or charter level to come back to this meeting and say, well, the K-3 ad hoc said X, Y, and Z. I think it's really important to drive home that as districts, you need to work with your district or charter lawyers and to determine the statute. What Deputy Director Baden is saying is that the statute is silent on whether or not a third grade student could be held back multiple times in third grade due to the move on when reading retention law. And if you look in your recommendations from the previous agenda item, number 3 under issue 1 is to clarify that guidance for just that third grade. It was never recommended to, if that student's held back in first grade and then we hold them back again in third grade. We didn't discuss that. It was just that third grade piece. And so I think Sean will follow up with you on some of your questions, Member Ref, and I think we should move on to the next section.
Thanks for keeping us on track. Any other comments? Member Welborn.
Chairman Clark, I have a question. Sean, I'd like to address this to you. So one of the things I really appreciated with the new dyslexia legislation is that there was an actual agreed upon definition in the legislation on these are the characteristics that we're going to use. And I see in education legislation, I've read where he talked about the components of reading instruction, but is there a place in education law in Arizona where it says these are the pieces of reading skills that we are teaching?
Chairperson Clark, Member Wellborn, there is in the Move On When Reading statutes 15-704, 15-701, and 15-211. It is embedded. There's a embedded definition of reading, the pillars of early literacy that we discussed. So phonological awareness.
Do we have that here in front of us?
We actually have it in front of us.
It's
In the statute language, second to last page.
Second to
Okay,
last
so
page.
that reading, okay.
Look at J, Member Wellborn.
There we go.
Okay, so is
One,
it 3, A through F? Is that what we're talking about?
J, 1 through
Whoops.
A to F. The second to last page.
Well, no, this says reading instruction, not what,
Oh,
not,
yeah, and before that, it is the,
There's reading down there, too.
so it's this. No, this is reading instruction.
no, if the whole,
It's not here.
the whole thing is not here, this is just where the changes are represented, so we don't have the full 15704
Okay.
here, but it is in there.
So, but there's something similar to it. Okay. So, and then I'm remembering the comments we've heard about the, one of the negatives of the ERZ merit exam has been the lack of good, intelligent information coming back to teachers and parents on what was learned from the exam. If we want to avoid that pitfall and these new benchmarks and assessments, is that something that goes into legislation, or is that something that goes into the rules down the road?
Chair Clark, Member Wellborn, I believe we're speaking of like the statewide assessment and
Well,
third
the
grade.
two that we're calling for here, the new universal screener
Be in the RFP, correct?
and the benchmarks, these new assessments that we're calling for.
Chairwoman Clark, Member Wellborn, it would be in the RFP in which that would
Okay.
be the appropriate measure. So going back to a couple meetings ago, this is the first step, and then once this passed, then the second step is for this committee. Or if it starts moving through, then this committee can start having those conversations of areas that
Okay.
the state board should be aware of.
Okay.
Member Yanez, well, and then we'll come back to Member Welborn if she has any.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I appreciate the acknowledgement that this has been amended to include timelines. On the session law piece itself, and I understand that's just, sort of high-level draft language. It does not include assessment in there. So I assume that would be sort of a later ask. Is that the thinking there?
Madam Chair and Representative Yanez, Member Yanez, I don't know if you got elected recently.
Call me
Or maybe,
Chair, all right.
I feel like I'm already at the legislature. Yes, I think we had envisioned incorporating that into the assessment ask because there was going to be an assessment ask as part of the assessment plan, and I think we envisioned incorporating that as part of it rather than here because we felt like it might be awkward to appropriate, an estimate of some of these other assessments when we kind of feel like it's part of the whole assessment plan, but certainly recognize that there is a cost there that we're going to have to come up with a number for.
Yes. So, Madam Chair, I think that is could be a good strategy to do that. But when you separate the policy from the dollars, make sure the policy has sort of contingency language. Otherwise, you're left holding the bag if you don't get the other piece. So I didn't see that in there. And then the other, and this is not necessarily a question for this committee, but the ask is, this is a recommendation going to the board. The dollars, appropriately so, would be for technical assistance primarily to the department. However, I don't know if, I thought I heard Member Cruz indicate that there was no specific ask from the department. So I just want to make sure that those are aligned so that it's the board and the department both saying this is an appropriate request and so
I
that
can
there's not.
clarify that, yeah.
Member Cruz.
We did not, through the department processes, put in a specific budget package ask for K-12 standards for this coming session for a myriad of reasons, just other strategies. But this would be an appropriate place to put this in conjunction with this assessment system as they would be helping to administer this, and we could work in tandem with our policy team, et cetera, to help craft that. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
Was this the time you were going to tell me about you were going to give me feedback on my other?
Yeah, well, I guess, Madam Chair and Member Ref, if Sorry, I think I have a picture of it. I guess if maybe we could chat offline about what the intent is, because if the intent is a tone change in how the language is worded, because some of the language that you were requesting changed seemed to shift things from framing it in the negative to framing it in the positive.
Right, from saying a student, a child has a reading deficiency to a child has not demonstrated, what's the word I use?
Sufficient
reading skills. Yeah, I think there's a big difference there. When we say a child has a reading deficiency, we don't really know that. We know what they're demonstrating. And I feel like some of that language started to be changed in the last revision. It's just not consistently changed. So that's all I pointed out. If this was a time when we're re-looking at language, that maybe that would be a time to improve the clarity on what we're trying to say there, that students who are not demonstrating sufficient reading skills would be eligible for intervention, or whatever section of the law that we're reading that uses that language.
Madam Chair and Member Ref, let me take a look, because you're right, there are plenty of other places that reference demonstrate sufficient reading skills.
Right.
And for consistency, I think it would make sense to line those up if that is the case. I think when I had originally saw it, I think I had thought that we were just wordsmithing, and I wanted to caution against wordsmithing statute too much if it didn't have a policy outcome or a policy behind it. But what you brought up seems more like, cleaning up that. So I think I'll take another look, and if that's the case, I think it's probably within the realm of staff and the committee's tacit agreement that we can clean that kind of stuff up.
And last question for you is it the intent after the board retreat and conversation and a discussion that at our next meeting you can inform us on some of the outcomes of that and the... Great.
Yes. And Madam Chair, members, before we wrap this up, I was supposed to make a distinction at the beginning that the ad hoc committee recommendations and the statutory changes are separate and apart from the presentation we got earlier about the dyslexia bill, and that the changes we incorporated into the draft that you see just because they haven't updated the online statutes yet, so I had to do it by hand just so we had the latest and greatest, but just to make the distinction for the folks in the committee, but also the folks watching in the audience that those are kind of two separate tracks right now. But that was it.
Thank you, Catcher. Thank you. All right, moving on to our, I think one of our last items was presentation and discussion on early literacy's role in the school improvement process, and you had asked for feedback at the last meeting.
So Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, at the last meeting, I asked for members to start thinking about how early literacy plays into school improvement. And the reason for that ask is because the state board's also doing a lot of research right now around school improvement. It's going to be a major topic at our board's retreat this weekend and then through the fall. As we discuss school improvement as it sits on the state level, right, we already have the federal level, which is comprehensive and targeted support, but we also have school improvement as it's listed in state statute. Currently, it's not funded at the state level. However, the board's going to be looking into potentially changing how school improvement at the state level is operated, but also advocating for funding for that funding for the support of school improvement at the state level. Therefore, I wanted this committee to have a conversation around school improvement and early literacy. If the school is found to be placed in school improvement, most likely it would be aligned to letter grades, right? Where and what should the state's responsibility be to help that school improve their early literacy system, especially at a K-8, right? So let's focus just on the K-8 kind of spectrum. So your K-1, 2, and 3. What does that look like? What do you think the state should do or impose? Because remember, if we go into some type of school improvement that's similar to like a receivership where the state takes over, we can impose more stricter guidelines and take away some of that local control power. So just your thoughts, and that would help me with my conversation with the board.
Member Foley.
One of the things I think about that is one of the positive things that comes out of the Move On when reading legislation is it kind of, for me, is like the ingredients, if you will, of a good recipe that are what we know are important, sound, facets of solid reading. I would think that one of the things that would happen, obviously, we legislatively have some components that are important. If we are finding that there is not outcomes, or say the need for intervention support targeted, as something when we envision how do we help would be guidance on how to do those requirements better and more consistently.
Member Ruff.
I guess my question would be around capacity. What is the capacity when we say, like, we want to provide support? Who would be providing support? What is the capacity to provide support, not just in terms of money, but in terms of when we look at schools who are in improvement, either comprehensive improvement or targeted improvement, do we know what works in every one of those varied systems across the state and what is not working? And do we have the capacity to support that? One of the things that comes to mind, and maybe it does tie in with this work of this committee, is that the vast number, and Dr. Cruz, you could probably speak to this more, of schools who were identified in need of targeted support based on the AZ merit scores of the special ed subgroup. And so when we look at that vast amount of schools who identified there, do we know what the answer is in this state? Does our outcomes look any different than they do in other states around that population? Like, it's a big question that I know that when we were in a conference last fall at the ESSA conference, the people in the room were very much in favor of like really digging in together to change those outcomes, but there didn't seem to be very many ideas for support. Instead it was, now you will submit this form and that form and the other form, and there really were not any answers that were offered. And when we have that great of a scale of differentiated outcomes between a certain subgroup and the average of all students, there's something systemic that needs to be looked at. And I don't know what that capacity exists at right now, because I think if it did, if someone knew the answer, we wouldn't have all of those schools failing on such a great scale. So I don't know if we're seeing differences between Arizona and other states, but I would think that would be the first thing that we would need to know is what is our capacity to support.
You'll say something? Okay. Member Yanez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what I agree, capacity is, I think, the first question. And so I was sort of on the side here asking, what's the staffing levels in the department? Because I've seen over the years it goes up and down. I don't think school improvement on a state level has been funded since like 2007.
Nope.
And my understanding is all the staff right now are federally funded. So so there's that, which is no little issue. And then sort of this is just a very high level comment and how I think about that whole process, and I've seen different iterations of it from this building's perspective. I get a little bit nervous when you start prescribing exactly what the school improvement process should look like and include, frankly, either as board policy or as statute. And the reason I say that is because when, in my experience, you have such a diverse set of reasons for why schools find themselves in school improvement. Mm-hmm. And when I've seen it work well, it's usually when the department and their experts who go out in the field and do the site visits with these schools and work with the schools to figure out, okay, well, what do we need to do to help this school raise performance?
What's the need?
It could be a literacy issue. It might be something else. It usually has, literacy is usually in there. But so my high level thought or comment for the board to consider is whether or not it's wise to sort of think about it in terms of enshrining specific actions that should be taken, rather than just looking at it from the perspective of, it's a responsibility that falls with great limitations and capacity to the department. And I think there should be some trust there that as the department is doing its work, if there's a literacy issue, they're going to address it. And so that's how I think about it.
Thank you, Member Yanis. I would build on that, Vince. I think that's exactly it. For me, it was hard. It's hard to separate out what they, literacy and the move on when reading plans and all of that should just be, it's intertwined in the school improvement process but it is sort of an assessment of needs, of effective leadership, of school climate, of cultivating leadership beyond the administrator down to the teacher level and making sure teachers are supported with great instructional practice. So I would say two things, not to impose, but to help any school that finds themselves in that situation, the ability to work with the state agencies involved to identify how and have an intentional focus on the implementation of their Move On When Reading plan and fidelity to it. And then I would say effective leadership and how do you build the capacity at that site level to be able to identify strong literacy practices when they go in for, and throughout, and to then be able to translate that into what do I need to make sure my staff, my trainers, my teachers get so that we can move in the direction we need to move. So for me, it's sort of, those are key things, and if it's, and then use of data to help continue moving in that direction. I don't know if that's probably, but that I think echoes that. There's not a cookie cutter approach. It's a how do we work to help identify Member Wellborn, Member Cruz, Member Foley.
Thank you, Chairman Clark Cruz. It's sort of Cruz Clark. So, from a non-educator point of view, I observe that when it comes to fiscal management of schools, there is a hard stop whereby the state takes over. And there's a lot of warnings and things that happen when you're out of compliance with your financial management. But when the state board, when you finally go too far, the state board sends in a new team. And the new team is a consulting team. They take over responsibility from the local board, and they put into place all sorts of measures to get the house in financial order. And it has to do with, the principals and those kinds of things. So when I think about the academic achievement component of it, I observe that we don't do the same thing. We don't have a hard stop at the bottom for the folks. We don't say that when you're at this level of F or this level of non-reading, like in the single digits, we don't have a hard and fast line whereby the state could take over and put in a new management team. And it's very disruptive. It's very controversial. However, it does serve the purpose of making it very clear on trying to turn around and salvaging the very worst performers. And I don't know what the percentages of schools that are in some sort of format are working it out. But other states have done this. Other states go in, when you're at some level, standard below that level, they go in and the state takes over. And they put in teams of people that actually are effective leaders and whatnot. So I bring it up because I think it can be an effective tool for motivating and incenting improved performance and for not tolerating repetitive poor performance. And it brings around the solutions you need, because it does go very school specific. They go in and they're going to analyze what the problems are, and they're going to go in and figure out how to address particular issues. We have a lot of, when you talk about capacity, well, the state doesn't have capacity for this. We actually have a lot of capacity. It's just not at ADE. It's out in the fields. It's in your district and your school and whatnot. We have a lot of very capable, effective leaders, principals, and superintendents that are doing fabulous work. Why would we not ask them, reward them, incent them to take on an increased responsibility in helping us turn around the bottom performers? I don't know. I just think that would be such an easy solution to take a district superintendent who's already got 20 or 25 schools and say, here's another school that's met this minimum bar, and hand it over. Why do we continue to allow local school boards to manage that school? I don't understand.
Member Cruz and then Member Fold.
So I'll just add on that I certainly think literacy is an integral part of school improvement. And who knows, I don't have statistics on, but if they're in school improvement, chances are there's a serious chink in the armor in their literacy program for sure. And I know we are an incredibly diverse state, so certainly a cookie cutter approach is not what we would want for anybody, but I would certainly advocate for a common framework that we would apply to anywhere we would go, because there's certainly research to support that. This is not rocket science. This is well documented, and there's a lot of research to support what good turnaround looks like, and there are frameworks out there that are very well backed by research that we should take a look at.
I just want to echo some things that were said here, and the fact that yes, while we do know that we know what it entails for the teaching of reading, it is so multifaceted in the need. I think about the case studies that you just did on those schools that were amazingly successful, and we had that principal come and talk to us. And I think what was important to your point too, being that it is not that there are key ingredients that we know, but there isn't a silver bullet. There isn't a curriculum. It is a multifaceted, complex, what requires expertise in those areas that we know are key for making sure students are able to read, and the support then. So I hear all of us are sort of saying, while we know what it entails, the answer is multifaceted and complex based on many factors. And even when we've studied those that were super successful, we heard that kind of echoed. So I think that's an important thinking when we have that conversation, is to capture the diverseness of the answers here.
Well, if I can add on to that, Member Foley, that's exactly what a superintendent or principal would do. And if a superintendent has a school that's not performing up to expectations and they put in a new principal, that's what they're expecting. They expect them to look at the 18. 11% of the schools, this was the best results they had. 11% showed 10% or greater growth in ELA and math proficiency from 2017 to 18. Now, we all know that growth takes more than 1 year to happen. You just can't turn things around in 1 year. It takes 3, 4, 5 years to happen. But my suggestion is that this isn't very good outcomes. And what's missing from the current plans is the leadership component. There's a lot of effort on well, let's retrain the principals. So we'll send them to a leadership school that takes 2 years. Meanwhile, we wait 2 years for them to take that class and implement what they're learning. In education, my observation, there's not enough credit and recognition given to the principals and the superintendents who are really good at this stuff, and they can fix it. And let's just figure out a system that lets them do it, rather than struggling with the lack of capacity we have here at the state level. I said the same thing.
I'm going to let you be the last comment, so we're over time.
All right, I'll be quick. I just want to say, coming from the school level, that I so appreciate what everybody's saying about not being a cookie cutter program, because if a school is failing and there needs to be some help done, it's nice to know that somebody may come in and, similar to what we do with our students, run a diagnostic on the school, figure out where the needs are, and maybe have a framework of what things that they can pull from to help based on that diagnostic of the school and what's been happening. So I appreciate all the talk about having it not be cookie cutter.
Thank you. All right. With that, we are at the end, and future meetings and any items for future agenda.
Chairwoman Clark, members.
We have a meeting in September.
We have a meeting in September. I gave you that information in the email I sent you on Friday. I am very excited because Education Commission of the States is actually going to come here live and present. Some of you had seen their presentation from the governor's office convening. However, when I went for the executive directors meeting in Denver a couple weeks back, they had expanded upon their initial presentation they gave us. So the information I learned was phenomenal, but it's still embargoed. So I was able to get them a couple weeks after the embargo lifts, and the researcher who did that work may also come. So it's a great opportunity to ask a lot of questions of the research. I know we had some discussion in our executive directors meeting, as well as the meeting that you all attended in the governor's tower around the data piece and how things were collected. And it's really great questions, but I'm sure that she will be able to answer that since she did the work. We will then review some of the information we bring back from the retreat.
Great.
Can I ask, so in my notes, I have 2 meetings in September, the 5th and the 12th. Did we combine those? Or is it just the 12th? Or just
No,
the
ma'am,
5th?
it's just the 12th.
12th, thank you.
I can't do any more meetings.
All right. So then with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.